last couple of months talking about the success of Nintendo Switch 2 and how Nintendo has won the console war and how all these games are just massive, massive successes and huge cultural phenomenons. Obviously, Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza will go on to be seen as some of the best games released this year. But one of the interesting things about this console cycle is how certain games that were downplayed and ignored when they first came out have kind of had a resurgence and have done extraordinarily well on Switch 2. Of course, you have games like Hogwarts Legacy, which have gone on to receive updates and upgrades on Switch 2, and continues to sell quite a lot on the platform. But you also have releases like The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, which was a game that was pretty aggressively downplayed and ignored when it first came out, but as of 2025, this is the most critically acclaimed game of the year, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is not far behind because it with these Nintendo Switch 2 updates, with these upgrades, with these visual refinements and upgraded frame rates, these are the best releases of the year. New games cannot compete with The Legend of Zelda. And this is pretty apparent, especially if you're like someone who's never played them before, that these are just phenomenal games and have just stood the test of time as all-time classics. Better than new games. And the embarrassing thing is, we're still in that weird process where the general gaming community is just refusing to admit it. So many people are trying to sell you on this idea that Silk Song was good, that Expedition 33 was good, that I don't know, Slop was good. Like you just hear all this nonsense from all these different people about how all these games are these like huge cultural deals and how they're still relevant. But the reality is, what most people are doing is that they're playing old games because new games have, unless they're Nintendo exclusive, have demonstrated themselves to be completely unreliable. They take years and years to come out, and every single time they are extraordinarily disappointing. Silk Song is a really good example of this. This was something made by a small team that a lot of people thought was going to be this huge deal, that this was going to be this huge, like, amazing 10 out of 10 masterpiece, a shoe in for game of the year. And what happens? A couple of months later, it is completely forgotten. And meanwhile, something like Tears of the Kingdom, which was supposed to be a failure and a disappointment, constantly keeps garnering new fans, keeps becoming more popular. People keep going back to it and realizing how good it actually is. And now, a couple of years after launch, it is getting a Warriors spinoff with Age of Imprisonment, which is only going to make the game more popular. Like, all of the copes that people had about Tears of the Kingdom, about the story and about the lore and about like, all of that is going to go up in smoke. The fact of the matter is, the fact that something like this exists only demonstrates just how successful the Zelda formula has been in recent years. And it is going to be increasingly impossible to downplay and ignore it. People hyped up Baldur's Gate 3, and not only did it get overshadowed by Tears of the Kingdom when it came out, Tears of the Kingdom has remained relevant years after the fact, long after Baldur's Gate 3 has completely been forgotten. Same with Elden Ring, same with Expedition 33. Like, these are not games that can carry a console generation. These are not the kind of games that people think are better than Zelda. Even when Skyrim came out, the entire cope about that was that, like, well, Skyrim at least is open world. There was no thought or consideration put into like the game itself, the quality of the gameplay, the content, like the replay value, the design of the dungeons or the world or the story, because Zelda clears the Elder Scrolls and all of that. But, the narrative was that Skyrim was more realistically rendered and open world, and that's what made it better. That's what made Skyrim such a success, is this idea that it was more realistic than Zelda. And over time, we have slowly seen people start to realize that Zelda is the better game overall because of the unique features, because of the mechanics, because of just how engaging this game actually is. Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have shown that they're going to remain relevant for decades after the fact. The simple fact of the matter is Breath of the Wild is 8 years old now, soon to be nine, almost a decade old game, and it's still outpacing Game of the Year contenders on Metacritic, with a re-release, you know, all while games like The Last of Us Part 2 flounder and fail to find an audience. you know, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are still doing well years after the fact, while their competition just completely fails. And this is going to be the trend going forward, I think, is that downplaying major Nintendo exclusives on the year of release is going to do absolutely nothing to impact their relevancy long term. That's just the reality of it. We saw this with Kirby Air Riders already, but this is also something we saw with Mario Wonder and Tears of the Kingdom. Is that a bunch of people will act skeptical, they'll freak out, they'll say the games look like trash and that they aren't going to play them, and that the game is going to be really disappointing and underwhelming, and that they'd rather play Sonic Racing Cross Worlds or some other slop. They'll do that before the game comes out, but after it comes out, after the game starts gaining fans and after it's on the eShop, it's never really going to stop being relevant. This is the problem that I think a lot of pretendos are going to have, is that Tears of the Kingdom is never going to be pulled from store shelves. It is never going to stop being relevant. It's never going to stop being talked about. It's always going to be getting upgrades and incremental adjustments when it comes to new Nintendo hardware. It's always going to have these slight re-releases, take advantage of new hardware power. It's always going to be you're going to see what happened with the Switch 2 over and over and over and over again with these re-releases. We're going to see it happen next year with Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Right? Nintendo Switch 2 versions of games guarantee that these games are going to remain popular and talked about forever. And you can't just sit there and say that well, I've already played those games, because plenty of people haven't. And new games are always coming out. So you are in between a rock and a hard place where you can't simply say that I already played that. I already played that, because no, you didn't. But also, new games were coming out all the time. Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild were two major Nintendo Switch 2 releases that a lot of people were not talking about, that a lot of people were downplaying, specifically because they were re-releases, completely unaware of the fact that plenty of people were buying Nintendo Switch 2s for the first time and had never played either of these classic games, especially in the case of Tears of the Kingdom, which a lot of people said was very, very disappointing when it first came out. This is the reality of the situation, is that downplaying Tears of the Kingdom the way you did upon its initial release ended with it becoming a major bestseller. Okay? This is a major cultural phenomenon, and something that you cannot downplay going forward. It is something that you need to accept and that you need to understand, is that Expedition 33 has already been outperformed by Pokemon Legends ZA within a week of release. It is something that you just need to accept, that Nintendo has won the console war. Armor Smith, he's the name.